guest today is one of the great spiritual masters of our time. Applauded, celebrated, awarded the Nobel Prize. One of India's great national inspiration. I'm delighted to welcome. Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today has been described as one of India's preeminent public intellectuals. He's been trained as a clinical psychologist. He's often regarded and celebrated as a leading sociologist, a political psychologist. He has authored numerous essays, monographs, books and publications, writing on a range of subjects. Some of the titles are like The Tao of Physics, The Enemy Within, The Illegitimacy of Nationalism, The Savage Freud, a man of many parts. I'm delighted to welcome Professor, Doctor, Scholar, Writer, Intellectual, Ashis Nandy. Amongst the sort of many sort of contemporary issues, you have written a book on the Tao of cricket. How do you react to, sort of the IPL cricket league that's coming up? Not just the 2020 format, you've written on nationalism, so not just on the interaction between, or the games between two countries, but the kind of tournament that is taking place. What is your passion for cricket, and do you find it's finding legitimate expression in the way new cricket is unfolding?
Well, my passion for cricket was that it was the only 19th century game which has survived through the 20th century. It is not a part of the urban industrial vision, and the very rhythm of the game, very expectations from the game, the style of playing, the conventions and the mannerisms associated with it are supposed to be are in fact a standing criticism of the urban industrial vision.
In what ways?
In the sense that, first of all, the cricket is a game of destiny. You not only play against your opponents, you play against your own fate. I mean, here you bat for 2 full days in bright sunshine, the ball doesn't swing, and then your opponents come in and just then there is a shower and the ball begins to swing. So you cannot equalize the weights in cricket. It's not like football when all the 22 players are on the ground at the same time, or hockey or any other game. Cricket is unique in this ways. You are expected to, at least you were expected to applaud even your opponents when they played well, because those 11 players around you, the fielders, are the first circle of audience you have, not the people sitting in the galleries. And if you misbehave, if you are unsporting, if you cheat, then you prove yourself to be a cad to your opponents, and that mattered in cricket. All these are going, and all these have mostly gone. Here is an Indian cricketer who claims that he didn't call his Australian opponent a monkey, and instead he abused, had a even much vulgar sexual abuse involving the Australian's mother, and all Indians consider this to be a good alibi. I think it is vulgar and obscene, if I may call it so, and nobody bothers an iota. In fact, that is seen as a part of necessary aggressiveness which allows you to win matches. I don't think Garfield Sowers won matches that way. I don't think Bradman won matches that way, though he was a tough cookie, much more than Sowers. And I don't think this was the concept of winning either. I don't think 2020 is going to remedy this thing. The only good point I can see in that game is this, that it shifts allegiance from the nation to the cities, and that's healthier at this point of time when Indians are having an epidemic of nationalism. According to a 44 country study, Indians are the world's most nationalistic country, and every day nonetheless you hear exhortations that Indians should be more nationalistic. I don't know how much more nationalistic they can be.
We'll come to nationalism in a moment, but to stay with sport, I think the other thing that's capturing the media and the news is, of course, the fate and the journey of the Olympic torch and the Tibetan protests that are worrying. The Chinese are raising concerns amongst the International Olympic Committee, and here you have a juxtaposition, another context where nationalism, or Tibetan nationalism, is influencing the fate of a sporting event. How do you see that unfolding?
Well, India and China are the only surviving 19th century nation states in the 21st century, or at least they are the two preeminent ones, and neither of these two countries have learned to move beyond that, even though Europeans who innovated the idea of the nation state have moved beyond nation state, at least as far as European Union is concerned. That flexibility, or rather the absence of flexibility in China and India, is in some ways a self-destructive process, because I think the world is changing, and expecting the world to keep their hands off you or accept you despite what you do to the Tibetans there or to the separatists here in India is rather innocent, I would say. But then that's the way we are being ruled, and we are part of that game. The two systems are very different, but as far as national touchiness goes, I think they are not that different. And the Tibetan situation would have been handled much better by China. After all the Dalai Lama had said that we are not seeking independence. India would have done anything to get at least that kind of a public statement from, say, for instance, the militants in Kashmir. But China is not satisfied what it has. It wants absolute obedience and absolute control.
How do you locate and interpret India's response to the way the torch is going to go through New Delhi, truncated from 32 kilometers to 3? What kind of signal, what does it tell you about the way we see the torch, the way we look at relations with China, the way we look at sports, the way we look at democracy, the way we look at the right to protest? A whole range of issues are subsumed in just this one decision.
Oh yes, it is no longer carrying the Olympic torch. It's a comical, symbolic act which symbolizes carrying the torch that had been a part of Olympics traditions. I think India can neither gulp it nor shed it. It doesn't want to antagonize China, and it doesn't want its separatists to get ideas either. So it has to do this. It is doing that, and every day it is becoming more of a farce.
You're watching a conversation with Ashis Nandy, public intellectual, political sociologist, and a writer and author of great eminence. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
मुझे NFSM की मदद याद है, उससे हमारी दलहन की फसल भरपूर होगी।
NFSM दलहन की फसल के लिए सल्फर और दूसरे पोषक तत्वों पर 50% तक की मदद और स्प्रिंकलर सेट लगाने के लिए भी 15,000 तक की मदद। NFSM की मदद है सच्ची, हर खेत के लिए अच्छी।
Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Ashis Nandy. In your writings, there is this sort of seeming, I was going to say dichotomy, but not really. Let's just say two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you write very profoundly of human creativity, of the human potential, but at the same time, you are also looking at the destructiveness of human destructiveness, of destructiveness that has emanated from movements of protest, of assertions of nationalism. You've looked at of the implicit violence in contemporary secularism that's innate in it. In this unfolding era of globalization, of economic globalization, what do you see happening to nationalism as an idea? So at the one hand you will have Chinese nationalism, and yet there is Chinese interdependence because of globalization. To the degree that they're able to balance this or not balance it, I think is now being demonstrated by their angsts about what happens at the Olympics. But not just looking at China, but in a larger context, what direction do you see nationalism being able to take?
I don't think this kind of nationalism that we are seeing in places like India or China has much of a future. More and more we will look like dinosaurs. This is because not only the world is changing, but the present global order is increasingly becoming hostile to that kind of clenched teeth nationalism. Nations and nation states at least are still the unit of international affairs. This is the way the United Nations is organized. This is the way countries deal with each other through this instrumentality of the nation state. But as a functioning entity, all societies are trying to find flexibility in the structures of the state, trying to liberate it from this bureaucratic stranglehold of the kind which you see in a country like India. There are efforts of that kind in India, but you can see from the nature of the enterprise that this effort is not taking you very far. And I am afraid we will be increasingly caught in a situation where our structures will not be able to cope up with the changes we are seeing around us. United States, for example, operates as a nation state, but also within it they have built enough flexibility for other kinds of people to come in within the states, acquire nationality, stay there for a year, including some who begin their day and end their day by abusing the United States. It is not nervous, it is confident about its power and its influence, and these dissenters are kind of turned into ornamental dissenters within the system. We used to have this kind of a capacity in the earlier years of independence. When we had more confident and more, how should I put it, more visionary politicians like Nehru at the helm of affairs, and this lasted for quite a long time. But I think since the last 30 years or so, there has been a significant change, and the culture of the state in India has increasingly become more paranoid. You see the same paranoid sentiments in China, and you do see the same paranoid sentiments in a number of other countries. I don't have to list them, but my feeling is this, that this is a way of dealing with the functions of the state, which in the long run impoverishes you. You cannot bring in a person into India who provides any kind of an criticism of the regime unless he happens to be a state guest or something. I mean, you cannot just, even to invite somebody to give a seminar or give a lecture, you need a clearance from the babus. Notoriously not suspicious of every foreigner. They are suspicious of any kind of criticism, any kind of dissent.
But surely, I mean, you have on at least 2 occasions in our conversations so far, equated China and India. Surely there are differences. I mean, we claim to be a vibrant democracy, no matter how imperfect, and compared that to the mechanisms and the state structures in China. What are the differences? Surely there are fundamental differences.
Oh, certainly. China is a full state.
And does that give us, in a sense, greater hope for the future, and in what
Yes,
ways?
I do think so, because the democratic system still gives us not only hope, but it keeps channels of change and intervention relatively open. China is a police state, and that fact cannot be denied. India is still an open democratic system, but do not forget that India is increasingly becoming a psephocratic state. That means a state which is primarily ruled by the idea of elections. You live from election to election, you plan from election to election, and just when you have planned the elections, celebrations are going on, you are already thinking of the next elections. There is nothing beyond that, and that makes it a rather uncomfortable, the state rather uncomfortable with kinds of dissent which has political implications. Look at the way Taslima Nasrin was handled only a few days ago. I mean, they called it safe heaven or whatever, safe house perhaps, but she was under house arrest virtually, and this is all because she might, the argument was that she might prove to be a liability as far as the Muslim vote bank went. And even the Marxists, CPM, collaborated with this system perfectly. In fact, they took an initiative in it. They didn't bat an eyelid taking a pro-fundamentalist position on this occasion.
So, in what would be your varying, prognosis, shall we say, about the future of these two ancient civilizations, China and India? I mean, I don't want to give it a time frame, 20 years, 50 years. Could you say?
I believe more optimistic about India than about China. The India, everything said, the democratic system, whatever is flaws, nonetheless assures you that initiatives can be launched from the peripheries of the system by ordinary people if they join up and organize. And many things have happened in India which are a direct proof of this. Like for example, India is no longer thinking in terms of very large dams. It had proved politically costly. So though they might abuse Medha Patkar in some of the states, Medha Patkar may be a persona non grata, and Sundarlal Bahuguna might be a laughing stock, but nonetheless the fact remains the politicians do not want to take the risk of demanding a very large dam, which will involve again another set of protests, another kinds of agitations, coverage by the newspapers, and so on and so forth. Now that's the way a democratic system works. It works slowly, it is often not very effective, but in the long run it has to respond to public opinion.
Do you share the view that there's a possibility that in China the center may not hold? The Tibetan protests have been spreading. There's a report of protests in other parts of China. There is talk and discussion about inequities and with the political system. What kind of future, what you think might happen?
I don't think China faces any danger of splitting immediately. In the very long run, one doesn't know. But I think this fear of being divided, the fear of being open to manipulation by Western powers particularly, but outside powers in general, is old in China, and that fear has no real basis now any longer. China is too powerful, too well to do, to be really susceptible to such machinations, unless his very unitary structure, its control on dissent and control on opposition itself creates a situation where the only way of confronting the regime is to have very large scale mass mobilization against the state. In this sense, the Chinese handling of Tibet is a very sad comment on the political acumen and sagacity of the Chinese leadership.
In what ways?
In the sense that they could have handled it much more smoothly, much more effectively. Heavens wouldn't have fallen if Tibet had been given more autonomy, and even if Tibet was given much greater degree of autonomy than the Chinese were prepared for. I mean, after all, its relationship nonetheless would have been closer to China than that of Taiwan. But I don't think they have the wisdom. They are a product of a system where this kind of dissent is seen as a basic subversion of the authority of the state.
You're watching a conversation with Professor Ashish Nandy, a public intellectual, writer, a man of letters. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
मैं तो सीधी सीधी बात करने वाला आदमी हूँ कि जिस जगह पे सत्य है वहाँ खुदा है, जिस जगह पे अहिंसा है वहाँ ईश्वर है।
Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Professor Ashish Nandy. You're working and have been working for a while on a book on partition, not just a book, but a whole research process on partition. What is the impetus for that journey, for that exploration? What are some of the lessons that you feel, or the insights that you're learning and that you set out to gain from that study?
Look, I was 9 years old when the great Calcutta killings took place. It was a trauma. I have seen my younger brother wouldn't eat for days after seeing a few killings from the windows of our apartment. I had seen how my grandmother, my aunts who were there at the time would miss their meals or would say they were ill just because they just couldn't eat after seeing so much of bloodshed and gory violence of the kind that was taking place in Calcutta. So that was in my mind for many years, and like many others of that generation, I thought that the memories had faded. They came back to me almost like a documentary film when the anti-Sikh riots took place in Delhi, and from then onwards I was planning to do a study of this kind, because I knew that the people who were victims and the people who were perpetrators were not going to live forever. It was already 50 years and or maybe 40 years at that time, and that these were the last few years during which we could contact them and learn something about their experiences. And that's what at the fag end of my life prompted me.
Well, arguably so. Certainly not your intellectual life yet. But this process of documentation of oral histories of people's experiences has been done. But you bring to this your skill as a psychologist, as a sociologist, a much wider range of perspectives and an intellectual and academic framework. So what are some of the insights, the lessons, the conclusions that you're arriving at?
Well, one very serious implication is that I am now more or less convinced, not only from the work on this particular genocide, but from the experience of other genocides too, that the most gory and most vicious violence takes place usually amongst communities which are not strangers but very close to each other. The very closeness dooms these communities because the violence then becomes not only a matter of taking out one's anger against strangers, but taking it out on a part of yourself which you want to disown. The other represents parts of yourself. He or she represents a potentiality within you. You are afraid that you might be like him, and you are actually almost exorcising a ghost within you, and that gives a certain sharpness to the bitterness. So when two communities that are traditionally close to each other fall apart. The violence is more venomous. That is why in Punjab it took such a gory turn. That's one. And second thing I have found out from my study of genocide, once again not only in India but elsewhere too, that it usually takes 1.5 generation for people to handle this issue sensitively and in some depth. There is a silence that envelops such experiences in every community which has gone through genocidal experience. And that silence is the silence of not only the perpetrators who do not talk about their past, but also the victims who want to pretend that they have forgotten. We met a couple married for 45 years. Both the husband and the wife had lost their fathers in the partition violence. In 45 years of married life, they told us they had not exchanged a single sentence on the subject. And that kind of stories are all around us.
As the psychologist here, what would be the process of healing between the communities? To what degree do you think that has taken place already? What is left? What remains to be done?
It has not healed. The partition experience is the unstated presence in every negotiations, every diplomatic give and take that takes place between India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. It is the unspoken guest. Every time an Indian and a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi meet each other, and this, the healing cannot take place as long as it is pushed under the carpet. Healing begins to take place when you confront it and work through it. That's the term psychoanalysts use. But let us say healing takes place when you grapple with the experience and share it with others in a way that makes sense of the violence and which owns up the responsibility partly. Both sides have to own up their responsibility on the subject. It is not an accident that a psychoanalyst has proposed a museum on partition which will be shared by Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. I think there will be healing. I think we shall move towards healing now onwards, when many of the younger generation have begun to work on partition with such sensitivity and how should I put it, sensitivity as well as sense of responsibility.
You know, you talked about being towards the end of your life. I think most people would doubt that, certainly. You know, this has been a subject of great passion. You've written about so many passions. Are there any unarticulated passions?
In the partition war?
No, in general, in your work, in your striving, in what you want to explore, study, read, write about, talk about.
Well, there is the passion, I guess if you want to call it passion, that I believe that an open society and a democratic order are a way of releasing the energies of the peripheries and margins of the society. The peripheries and the margins of the society have